You know that feeling when you walk out of a voting booth, you've got your sticker, you feel a little burst of civic pride, but then maybe later that night you watch the results come in and you see a massive landslide.
Right.
And there's this nagging voice in the back of your head asking, did what I just do actually matter?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a pretty common existential crisis for voters. I mean, you look at the numbers and wonder if your ballot was just a drop in the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that the decision of whether your vote mattered wasn't made on Election Day? What if it was actually decided 2 years earlier in a back room by a guy with a customized computer program drawing a squiggly line around your specific neighborhood?
That is a terrifying, but honestly very accurate way to frame it. We
Yeah.
we tend to think democracy is about the people, but operationally, it's about the map.
And that is exactly where we are going today. We are taking a deep dive into the invisible architecture of the United States. We aren't talking about the big borders like the shape of Texas or the Florida Panhandle. We're talking about the internal lines, the ones that actually decide who runs the country.
Right. And to do that, we're unpacking a really fascinating source today. It's titled The Dynamics of Internal Boundaries and Electoral Representation.
Yeah.
It's technically from an AP Human Geography curriculum, topic 4.6 to be exact, but honestly, it reads like a manual on how to hack an election legally.
Legally being the operative word there. It's so interesting because we usually look at a map and think, okay, that's just where the city ends. It's just geography. But this source argues that every single line is a choice. And usually it's a highly political choice.
Precisely. You have to distinguish between international borders and internal boundaries. International borders are about sovereignty. It's where one country's laws literally stop and another's begin.
Right, like the U.S.-Canada border.
Exactly. But internal boundaries, those are about administration. It's about how you slice up the pie to manage a massive population within that sovereign territory.
And the source uses this phrase, nested hierarchy, which sounds a bit academic, but it immediately made me think of those Russian nesting dolls.
Oh, that is the perfect visual. You have the big doll, right? That's the federal government. You crack that open, and inside you have the states.
Right, the 50 bold outlines we all learned in grade school. And those are pretty rigid, aren't they? I mean, you can't just decide tomorrow that Wyoming is too empty and merge it with Montana.
No, absolutely not. The Constitution protects those state lines. But once you open the state doll, things get really messy. Inside the state, you have counties, which handle your local courts and property records. Then you open that, and you have service districts.
So that's like the lines that decide which fire truck comes to your house, or
Or which high school your kid goes to, exactly.
I feel like people get really heated about school district lines.
Oh, definitely. But there's an even smaller doll inside that one that actually determines the fate of the free world,
The voting district.
the voting district. It is the atomic unit of American politics. This is the line that groups you with your neighbors to send one single person to Washington. And unlike the state borders, these lines are written in pencil. They are not permanent. They change.
Okay, so before we get into the how of changing them, we need to talk about the why. Because the source brings up this tension between the Senate and the House of Representatives. And honestly, I always kind of forget the nuance here. Why does the House need these specific changeable districts?
It comes down to what you could call constitutional math. So think of the Senate as representing the land itself. Every state, no matter how huge or how tiny, gets 2 senators.
So Wyoming has the exact same power in the Senate as California,
Correct.
which seems wildly unfair if you look at it purely by population. But I guess that was the grand compromise to get the small states to sign the Constitution back in the day.
Exactly. It was a concession. But the House of Representatives is entirely different. The House represents the people. There are 435 seats in the House, and they're divided up based strictly on how many humans actually live in a given place.
Okay, but here is the catch that I think a lot of people miss. It's a zero-sum game, isn't it? The House is permanently capped at 435 members. They don't just, add more folding chairs to the room if the U.S. population grows.
That is the crucial point. It is a cage match for representation. If Texas's population booms and they gain 2 seats, those seats don't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
They have to be taken away from somewhere else, like New York or Ohio.
So basically, every 10 years, we have this massive national game of musical chairs.
And the music stops the second the census comes out.
The census. Most people just think of it as that annoying form you have to fill out so the government knows how many people live in your house. But in this context, the census is basically the starter pistol for a political war.
It really is. The source highlights a specific process called reapportionment. The census counts every nose in America. Then the federal government does the math to see which states grew and which ones shrank.
And this isn't just about state bragging rights. The source had this incredible historical example about the shift from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. We're talking post-World War II, up through the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, this was a massive cultural and political tectonic shift. You had millions of Americans leaving the industrial North and Midwest, places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. The factories were closing down, the weather was brutally cold.
And residential air conditioning had finally become affordable.
A huge factor, a total game changer. So people moved south and west, Arizona, Texas, Florida, and because of that constitutional math we just talked about, the political power physically moved with them.
So literally, the moving vans were carrying congressional seats down Interstate 95.
Effectively, yes. The North lost influence in Washington, and the Sun Belt gained it. And that changes the entire flavor of national politics. You go from policies favoring labor unions and heavy industry to policies favoring deregulation, the energy sector, and totally different social values.
Wow. So reapportionment handles the big picture, just how many seats a state gets overall. But then comes the actual dirty work. If a state has 10 seats, someone has to take a pen and draw the lines on the map to carve that state into 10 chunks.
Welcome to redistricting. This is where the rubber meets the road. Now, the goal, theoretically at least, is beautiful. It's about fairness. You want every district to have roughly the exact same number of people so that every citizen's vote carries equal weight.
The whole one person, one vote ideal.
Right, because if District A has 1 million people and District B has 10 people, the voters in District B are basically kings. Their individual votes are mathematically wildly more powerful. So every 10 years, we redraw the lines to balance the population scales.
But, and there is always a but in politics, who is holding the pen?
Yeah.
Because it's not usually some nonpartisan robot algorithm doing the drawing, is it?
No, not at all. In most states, the people drawing the maps are the state legislature, the politicians themselves.
Which seems like a massive conflict of interest. It's like letting the pitcher call his own balls and strikes.
It is exactly that. And this is where we get to the primary villain of our source material. Gerrymandering.
I love the definition the source gives for this. It says gerrymandering is the process where politicians choose their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians.
It completely flips the concept of democracy on its head. Usually a candidate has to go out, shake hands, kiss babies, and convince a diverse group of people to vote for them. But with gerrymandering, they just draw a highly specific line around the people who already like them and surgically cut out the ones who don't.
It sounds totally illegal.
Well, the source notes that it is technically challenged in courts constantly. It violates the spirit of fair representation. But it's incredibly hard to prove intent in a court of law. And the result is you get these maps that look, well, they look insane.
Yeah, let's talk about the visuals for a second. A normal district should look like a box or maybe a simple blob, right?
Yeah.
It should follow a county line or a river or a mountain range.
Right, it should respect the organic, physical, or cultural landscape. But gerrymandered districts look like Rorschach tests. They look like spilled coffee. You'll see these weird little tendrils reaching out miles and miles to grab one specific suburban subdivision and then winding back around to actively avoid a different neighborhood.
So how does the mechanic of it actually work? Because I think people hear the word gerrymandering and they just think cheating, but there is an actual dark art to it. The source breaks it down into 2 main strategies: cracking and packing.
Yes, these are the twin pillars of political map making. Let's start with cracking.
Okay, cracking. Paint the picture for me. How do you crack a map?
Imagine you are the blue party. You are in control of the state legislature, so you control the map making. But there is a mid-sized city in your state that is heavily populated by the red party. They have enough voters in that city to easily win a seat or 2 in Congress. You do not want that.
So I want to break their power.
Exactly. You crack their population center apart. You draw the boundary lines so that the city is sliced into 4 or 5 different pieces, almost like slicing a pizza. Then you attach each of those urban red party slices to a massive chunk of the surrounding rural countryside, which happens to be heavily blue.
So in every single one of those new districts, the red voters are totally outnumbered.
Right. They might make up 40% of the vote in 5 different districts, but they win 0 seats. You have completely diluted them.
It's like, okay, imagine you have a sugar cube. That's the opposition voters. If you drop that sugar cube in a small cup of tea, you can taste it. It has an impact. But if you dissolve that exact same sugar cube in a bathtub, it's gone. You've cracked it so wide it disappears.
That is a perfect analogy. You've rendered their voting power functionally invisible by spreading it too thin across too many districts.
Okay, so that's cracking. What about packing? Because it
Uh,
sounds like the exact opposite strategy.
It is the opposite, and map makers use it when the opposition is just too heavily concentrated to crack. Let's say there are just too many red voters in a huge metropolis to dilute. If you try to spread them out, they'll actually end up winning all the surrounding districts, too.
So you can't dissolve the sugar cube. You have to quarantine it.
Exactly. You pack as many of those opposition voters as humanly possible into one single district. You draw a bizarre shape that specifically circles all their neighborhoods. You essentially give them that one district. They win it by an absolute landslide, say 90% of the vote.
So they throw a parade. They feel great about their big win.
They feel great, but they've been played. Because you have effectively wasted all of those extra votes. In our winner-take-all system, you only need 50% plus one vote to win a seat. If you win with 90%, that's 40% of your voters that could have helped you win a neighboring competitive district. But instead, they are trapped in a district you were going to win anyway.
That is just diabolical. So you purposefully sacrifice one single seat to the opposition in order to guarantee that your party wins the other 5 surrounding seats comfortably.
Precisely. It's all about voter efficiency. You want your opponent to win incredibly big in a small number of districts, while your party wins narrowly but consistently everywhere else.
The source gives a really vivid, real-world example of this from North Carolina in the 1990s. And I want to get into this because it shows how this isn't just an abstract red versus blue game. It gets deeply into race and social demographics.
Yes, the infamous North Carolina 12th District. It is legendary in political science circles. So in the 90s, there was a legal push under the Voting Rights Act to create what's called a majority-minority district.
Which means what, exactly?
It's a district drawn specifically so that a minority group, in this case African-American voters who were historically wildly underrepresented, would have the concentrated voting power to elect a candidate of their choice.
Which sounds like a really good Democratic goal on paper.
The goal was fair representation. But the execution, well, the map makers in the state legislature, who were Republicans at the time, saw a massive political opportunity. They knew African-American voters in North Carolina statistically voted heavily for Democratic candidates, so they used the packing strategy under the guise of the Voting Rights Act.
I'm actually looking at the map of this specific district from the source material right now, and it is almost laughable. Doesn't look like a congressional district. It looks like a snake that got run over on the highway.
It was 160 miles long. It stretched all the way from Durham to Charlotte. But here's the real kicker. In some places, the district was literally no wider than the Interstate 85 highway corridor.
Wait, seriously? So if I'm driving my car down I-85, I'm inside the district. But if I swerve onto the exit ramp to get gas, I'm suddenly in a completely different political reality.
Literally, yes. They drew the boundary line specifically to capture the African-American communities living along that highway corridor and connect them into one long, continuous chain.
And what was the actual result of this snake district?
Well, a Democrat won that district easily, so technically African-American representation was achieved for that specific seat. But by packing all of those reliable Democratic voters into that one single snake, the surrounding districts across the state became significantly wider and much more securely Republican.
So the Republicans essentially cleaned up in the rest of the state.
Exactly. They effectively bleached the surrounding districts of Democratic votes. It's a very stark example of how you can take a legal mandate, one that is actively meant to help minorities, and weaponize it to actually limit their overall political influence across the broader state map.
This perfectly leads us to the big song. So what of the whole deep dive?
Yeah.
Because we aren't just talking about which political team wins on election night. We're talking about what this dynamic does to us as a society over time. If every single district is safe, if they are all mathematically either packed or cracked before a single vote is cast, what does that do to the actual politicians representing us?
It creates extremism. If you think about it, the logic is sound. If you are a sitting congressman in a district that has been heavily packed for your party, you have zero fear of losing the general election in November. The other party doesn't stand a chance.
Right. So you don't really have to listen to the other side at all. There's absolutely no incentive to compromise.
You don't. In fact, your only real threat to keeping your job is someone from your own party running against you in the primary election. Someone who stands up and says you aren't pure enough or radical enough.
Oh, wow. Right. If I'm a politician in a deep red district, My only fear is a challenger who is somehow redder than me. And if I'm in a deep blue district, I'm only scared of someone bluer.
Exactly. So the mathematical incentives of the map drive everyone away from the center and out to the fringes. The moderate middle completely disappears. And that leads directly to the gridlock we constantly see in Washington because nobody can afford to compromise without risking their job back home.
It also feels like it just reinforces our everyday social divisions. The source explicitly mentions this idea of spatial segregation.
It does. When map makers draw hard lines that separate people by race or economic class or culture just to get a temporary voting advantage, you are essentially telling those communities that they do not share a common destiny. You are physically creating echo chambers where people never have to interact politically with anyone who disagrees with them.
It essentially turns the map of the country into a giant us versus them chart.
And that deepens the polarization we feel every single day. The map isn't just reflecting our cultural divisions anymore. It is actively amplifying them.
So, is there any hope here? Or are we just doomed to be ruled by the squiggly lines forever?
Well, the source makes a point to remind us that these boundaries are dynamic. They are not permanent fixtures. They are constantly being challenged in court. And some states are actually taking action. They are moving to independent redistricting commissions.
Which means taking the pen away from the politicians.
Exactly. Giving the map-making power to a balanced panel of citizens or retired judges, people who don't have a vested interest in the outcome of the next election.
So the rules of the game can actually be rewritten.
They absolutely can.
Yeah.
But it requires voters to care about the really boring stuff. Everyone cares about who is running for president. Not nearly enough people pay attention to who is running for their state legislature. But those are the people sitting in the room drawing the maps.
It's the machinery of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And we ignore the machinery at our own peril.
Exactly. Democracy isn't a spectator sport, and it's definitely not a sport where you can afford to ignore who is hiring the referees.
I want to leave everyone listening with a final thought to chew on. We talked extensively today about packing. That specific strategy where you win your district by a massive 90% landslide because all your like-minded neighbors are jammed in there with you. If you live in a district like that, does your vote actually count?
It is a very provocative question,
Yeah.
because if the outcome was mathematically predetermined by a map maker 2 years ago, the general election is essentially just a formality. You might feel represented because your preferred guy won, but you really have to ask yourself, was this boundary line drawn to give me a voice, or was it drawn to quarantine me so I couldn't influence the competitive district right next door?
Are these lines drawn to represent us or to manage us? That's the real question. Look up your own congressional district map tonight. See if it looks like a neat little box or if it looks like a squashed snake. It might tell you a lot about how the system actually views you. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Always a pleasure.